Everyone laughed when the prince chose a powerless Omega, but they never realized they were laughing at the person who would one day change the fate of the entire kingdom. The grand hall of the royal palace was filled with nobles, dignitaries, and powerful families from across the realm. Golden lights reflected against the marble floors, elegant music filled the air, and every person in the room watched the center of the ceremony with curiosity. Today was supposed to be a celebration of unity between two important families. Instead, many saw it as a mistake. Standing beside the future ruler of the kingdom was Ethan Rivers, an Omega from a forgotten noble family. He wore a simple but elegant white royal outfit, his silver hair catching the warm light above him. His expression remained calm despite the countless whispers surrounding him. "Is that really the Omega the prince chose?" one noble quietly asked. "He does not look like someone who belongs beside the throne." Another person smiled and replied, "Perhaps the prince simply felt sorry for him." Ethan heard every word, but he did not react. He had learned long ago that people often judged what they could see while ignoring everything they did not understand. Across the hall stood Alexander Whitmore, the Alpha Prince and heir to the kingdom. He was known for his intelligence, discipline, and powerful presence. Many expected him to choose a partner who could strengthen his position among the royal families. Instead, he chose Ethan. The decision surprised everyone. Some questioned his judgment. Others openly believed the prince had made the wrong choice. But Alexander remained silent. He had his reasons. When he first met Ethan, he noticed something different. The Omega did not try to impress him. He did not chase attention or seek approval from the royal court. Ethan simply observed, listened, and carried himself with quiet confidence. After the ceremony, Alexander escorted Ethan through the palace corridors. The grand halls were beautiful, but they also carried years of tradition and expectation. "You heard what they said today," Alexander said calmly. Ethan looked toward the large windows overlooking the kingdom. People always have something to say when they do not understand something. Alexander studied him carefully. Most people would be upset. Ethan smiled slightly. Being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. Those words stayed in Alexander's mind. He had expected Ethan to need reassurance. Instead, he found someone who seemed completely comfortable standing alone. That evening, the royal council discussed the marriage behind closed doors. Many believed Ethan would become a burden for the prince. They saw him as a weakness that others could use against the crown. They did not see the way Ethan quietly studied every person in the room. They did not notice how quickly he understood the hidden tensions between different families. They did not realize that the Omega they called useless was not lacking anything. He was simply hiding everything. As the days passed, Ethan began his new life inside the royal palace. He remained polite, patient, and distant from unnecessary attention. But Alexander started noticing small details. Ethan remembered conversations others forgot. He recognized changes in people's behavior. He seemed to sense problems before anyone mentioned them. For the first time, the prince wondered if everyone else had been wrong about Ethan Rivers. Maybe the Omega beside him was not someone who needed protection. Maybe he was someone whose true abilities had been hidden for a reason. And while the kingdom continued to laugh at the prince's choice, a secret from Ethan's past was slowly moving closer to the surface. The days after the royal marriage revealed something unexpected to Alexander Whitmore. The Omega everyone believed was fragile was not struggling to adapt to palace life. Instead, Ethan Rivers moved through the royal halls with a calm confidence that made people question everything they thought they knew. The palace was filled with traditions, rules, and expectations, but Ethan seemed to understand them naturally. He never demanded attention. He never tried to prove himself. Yet somehow, people noticed him more than anyone else. Alexander had spent his entire life surrounded by individuals who wanted something from him. Nobles wanted influence. Families wanted alliances. Advisors wanted their voices heard. Ethan was different. He asked for nothing. One morning, Alexander invited Ethan to explore the royal archives, hoping to help him understand the history of the kingdom and his new position. The archive room was filled with ancient books, family records, and documents that had been preserved for generations. "The royal family has many responsibilities," Alexander explained. "Living here means understanding the history behind every decision." Ethan quietly looked through the records. "History is usually written by the people who have the power to preserve it," he replied. Alexander looked at him with curiosity. You say that as if you have seen it happen before. Ethan paused for a moment. Everyone has a story that others do not know. That answer stayed with Alexander. It was not a refusal to share. It was a reminder that Ethan carried experiences he had never spoken about. As the weeks continued, Alexander began noticing unusual things about his new husband. During council discussions, Ethan could quickly understand complicated situations. When nobles tried to create tension between families, Ethan noticed the hidden reasons behind their words. When others focused only on appearances, Ethan looked deeper. The prince began wondering how someone who had been called useless could possess such awareness. One afternoon, the royal court gathered for a formal event. Several nobles approached Ethan with polite smiles, but their words carried hidden judgment. They asked questions designed to make him uncomfortable, expecting him to remain silent. Instead, Ethan answered with patience and intelligence. He did not challenge them. He did not seek approval. He simply showed that he belonged. Alexander watched from nearby, realizing that Ethan's greatest strength was not something obvious. It was his ability to remain steady when others tried to make him doubt himself. Later that evening, Alexander found Ethan standing in the palace garden. The sunset painted the sky with warm colors, creating a rare moment of peace inside the busy royal world. "You handled today well," Alexander said. Ethan looked at him. "I only spoke honestly." Alexander smiled slightly. "Most people are afraid to do that here." Ethan looked across the garden. "Fear makes people hide who they are. I think honesty is easier when you stop trying to become what others expect." Alexander was silent. Those words affected him more than he expected. The prince had always believed that power meant carrying every responsibility alone. But Ethan showed him another perspective. Strength could also come from knowing yourself. Meanwhile, hidden within the palace records, an old name connected to Ethan's family began appearing again. A name that had been removed from history. A name that suggested Ethan's past was not as simple as everyone believed. While the kingdom continued to underestimate the quiet Omega beside the throne, Alexander was beginning to understand one truth. Ethan Rivers was not someone who had entered the palace by accident. There was a reason his story had been hidden. And soon, the prince would discover that the person everyone ignored had a past powerful enough to change everything. The more time Alexander Whitmore spent beside Ethan Rivers, the more he realized that the rumors surrounding the Omega had never told the complete story. The people at court saw a quiet figure who rarely spoke about himself. They saw someone without a powerful family name or political influence. But Alexander saw something different. He saw someone who noticed details others missed and understood situations before anyone explained them. One morning, the royal court gathered for an important discussion about the kingdom's future alliances. Several noble families presented their opinions, each trying to influence the direction of the conversation. Ethan stood beside Alexander, listening carefully. He did not interrupt. He did not seek attention. But when the discussion became complicated, he quietly pointed out a connection between two decisions that others had overlooked. The room became silent. Several nobles exchanged surprised looks. Alexander noticed their reactions. They were not expecting wisdom from someone they had already judged. After the meeting ended, Alexander walked with Ethan through the palace corridors. "How did you notice that?" Alexander asked. Ethan looked at him. "Because everyone was focused on what they wanted others to see." Alexander considered those words. "And you were looking at something else." Ethan nodded. "People reveal more through what they avoid saying than what they choose to say." That answer made Alexander even more curious. It was not the response of someone inexperienced. It sounded like the understanding of someone who had spent years studying people and situations. Later that afternoon, Alexander reviewed old records connected to Ethan's family. He discovered that many documents from the past were incomplete. Important information about the Rivers family had disappeared from official archives. The missing records were not random. Someone had carefully removed parts of the story. When Alexander asked Ethan about it, the Omega remained calm. "Some histories are forgotten because they are unimportant," Ethan said. "Others disappear because someone does not want them remembered." Alexander looked at him carefully. "Which one is yours?" Ethan did not answer immediately. For a moment, the confident expression he always carried became more serious. "I think mine is the second." Those words changed everything. Alexander had always believed the biggest challenges in the kingdom came from outside threats. But now he wondered if some secrets had been hidden much closer to home. Over the following days, Alexander began paying closer attention to Ethan. He noticed how naturally Ethan moved through difficult conversations. He noticed how quickly Ethan understood the intentions behind people's actions. He noticed that the Omega who was supposed to be a burden was often the person who made complicated situations easier. One evening, during a private dinner, Alexander finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind. Why did you let everyone believe those things about you? Ethan looked down at his cup for a moment. Because sometimes being underestimated gives you the freedom to see the world clearly. Alexander was surprised by the answer. Ethan continued, people show their true nature when they believe they have nothing to fear. The prince realized that Ethan had not been powerless. He had simply chosen not to reveal everything. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, old stories about the river's family began appearing again. People who remembered fragments of the past started asking questions. A forgotten name was being mentioned in places where secrets were rarely discussed. The Omega everyone called useless had become the subject of attention from people who finally understood that they might have misunderstood him from the beginning. And as Alexander continued searching for the truth, he discovered a hidden connection between Ethan's past and a forgotten tradition that once protected the kingdom. The quiet Omega beside him was not just hiding a secret. He was carrying a legacy that had been waiting years to return. The discovery of the Forgotten Rivers family records changed the way Alexander Whitmore viewed the royal palace. For years, the kingdom had accepted a simple version of history. Certain families were powerful. Others had faded away. Some names were remembered, while others disappeared. But as Alexander studied the missing records connected to Ethan Rivers, he began to realize that the truth was far more complicated. Ethan was not someone who came from a powerless background. He was someone whose history had been carefully hidden. One evening, Alexander invited Ethan into the oldest archive room beneath the palace. The room contained thousands of documents collected over centuries, including records that even many royal advisors had never seen. Candles illuminated the shelves as Alexander placed a collection of old papers on the table. Your family name appears here, Alexander said. But every record after a certain point is missing. Ethan looked at the documents quietly. He had expected this moment for years, but experiencing it was different. Some people believe my family should disappear from history, Ethan said. Alexander studied his expression. Why? Ethan looked toward the shelves filled with forgotten stories. Because people become uncomfortable when they cannot control what someone else knows. Alexander understood that. Ethan was not talking only about records. He was talking about a lifetime of being misunderstood. The prince realized that Ethan had spent years allowing people to believe a false image of him. Not because he lacked confidence, but because revealing the truth could create consequences he wanted to avoid. As they continued examining the documents, Alexander discovered references to a special tradition connected to Ethan's ancestors. They were known for protecting the kingdom during uncertain times, using knowledge, strategy, and skills passed through generations. Their role was never about seeking recognition. It was about responsibility. You knew all of this before entering the palace, Alexander said. Ethan nodded. I knew who my family was. But I also knew the world had changed. Alexander looked at him. And you chose to hide. Ethan answered calmly. I chose peace. Those words affected Alexander deeply. He had always viewed power as something that had to be displayed. Ethan showed him that sometimes the strongest people were the ones who did not need everyone to notice them. Over the next few days, Alexander began changing how he treated Ethan. He no longer made decisions without asking for his opinion. He no longer assumed he understood what Ethan needed. Instead, he started trusting him. The difference was noticed throughout the palace. Advisors who once ignored Ethan began listening. Noble families who once mocked him became more careful with their words. But not everyone welcomed the change. Some members of the royal court believed Ethan's growing influence was a threat to their plans. They had spent years believing the Omega beside the throne was harmless. They did not realize that their misunderstanding had been their greatest mistake. Meanwhile, Ethan sensed that something was changing around him. The hidden parts of his past were becoming impossible to keep separate from his present. He knew the day would come when he could no longer remain the quiet Omega everyone underestimated. That evening, Alexander found Ethan standing near the palace balcony, looking over the kingdom. Are you worried about what happens when people learn the truth? Alexander asked. Ethan remained silent for a moment before answering. I am not afraid of the truth. I am afraid of what people will do when they finally understand it. Alexander stood beside him. Then they will learn with me standing beside you. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt that he did not have to carry everything alone. But somewhere beyond the palace walls, people who knew fragments of Ethan's forgotten past had begun moving closer. The secret that protected him for years was about to become the truth that changed the entire kingdom. The secret surrounding Ethan Rivers was no longer something hidden only inside the royal archives. As more people began noticing the changes within the palace, questions about the quiet Omega beside the throne started spreading throughout the kingdom. The same people who once dismissed him as a useless partner for the prince were now wondering why Alexander Whitmore trusted him so completely. But Ethan remained focused on one thing. He did not want recognition. He wanted the truth to be understood. One morning, Alexander invited Ethan to a private meeting room where only the highest members of the royal family were allowed to enter. On the table were old documents, family records, and information connected to the forgotten history of the river's name. There is something I need to understand, Alexander said. Who were you before you came here? Ethan looked at the documents for a long moment. He knew the answer would change the way people saw him forever. I was someone who learned that being unnoticed could sometimes be safer than being respected, Ethan replied. Alexander listened carefully. He no longer searched for secrets because he wanted to judge Ethan. He searched because he wanted to understand the person standing beside him. Ethan finally explained that his family had once carried a special responsibility connected to the protection of the kingdom. They were not famous nobles who attended every royal event. They were people who worked quietly, using knowledge, strategy, and discipline to prevent hidden dangers from affecting innocent lives. Their existence was never meant to become a symbol of power. It was meant to remain unknown. Then why did everyone believe you were useless? Alexander asked. Ethan gave a small, thoughtful smile. Because people often confuse silence with weakness. That answer stayed with Alexander. He realized that Ethan's greatest ability was not something that could be measured by titles or wealth. It was his patience, his awareness, and his ability to remain calm when others were controlled by fear or pride. As the days passed, Alexander began including Ethan in important royal discussions. The change was noticed immediately. The Omega who was once ignored now had a voice that many people respected. He did not demand attention. He earned it through his actions and understanding. However, not everyone welcomed this transformation. Some members of the royal court had spent years benefiting from the old order. They believed Ethan's presence beside Alexander represented a change they did not want. They started searching for information that could be used to question his place in the palace. But what they discovered was not a weakness. It was a history they never expected. Meanwhile, Alexander and Ethan continued growing closer through trust and honesty. One evening, they walked through the royal gardens beneath the stars. When we first met, I thought I was the one protecting you, Alexander said. Ethan looked at him with a calm expression. And now? Alexander smiled slightly. Now I think we protect each other. For Ethan, those words carried a meaning he had never expected to receive. He had spent years believing he had to keep every burden to himself. But Alexander had shown him that trust did not make someone weaker. It gave them strength. Yet beyond the palace, a forgotten group connected to Ethan's past had started paying attention. They knew the truth about his abilities. They knew why his family had disappeared from public history. And they knew that the day would come when Ethan could no longer remain hidden. The kingdom still saw him as the Omega who had been underestimated. But soon, they would discover that the person they ignored had always been the one quietly prepared for the challenges ahead. The relationship between Ethan Rivers and Alexander Whitmore had changed in a way that surprised everyone inside the royal palace. What began as a marriage surrounded by doubt had slowly become a partnership built on trust. The people who once questioned the prince's decision now watched carefully, trying to understand why Alexander valued Ethan's opinion so deeply. But while the palace was learning to see Ethan differently, new concerns were beginning to appear beyond the royal walls. The forgotten history of the Rivers family had attracted attention from people who wanted to understand why such an important legacy had disappeared. One morning, Alexander received a message containing information about old events connected to Ethan's family. Instead of hiding it from him, Alexander immediately asked Ethan to review it together. That simple choice showed how much they had changed. Before, Alexander would have tried to carry every responsibility alone. Now, he understood that trusting Ethan was not a weakness. It was respect. Inside the royal study, they examined the information carefully. The records revealed that Ethan's family had once been known for their ability to identify hidden threats and protect the kingdom through knowledge and preparation. Their methods were different from traditional royal forces. They focused on understanding people, predicting situations, and preventing problems before they could grow. Alexander looked at Ethan with admiration. You spent years knowing all of this, yet you never used it to gain influence. Ethan calmly answered, because influence was never the reason my family existed. Those words reminded Alexander why Ethan was different from everyone else he had met. Many people in the royal court wanted power because they wanted recognition. Ethan had power but chose peace instead. As the weeks continued, Alexander began relying on Ethan more during important decisions. Their partnership became visible to everyone. When advisors presented complicated situations, Ethan offered perspectives that helped the kingdom find better solutions. He never tried to replace Alexander. He simply stood beside him. However, some members of the court became increasingly uncomfortable. They had expected Ethan to remain silent and dependent. They had expected the prince's marriage to create a weakness. Instead, it created a stronger alliance than they imagined. One evening, Alexander and Ethan walked through the palace garden after a long day of meetings. The quiet atmosphere gave them a rare moment away from royal responsibilities. Do you regret coming here? Alexander asked. Ethan looked at the lights of the palace behind them. At first, I thought I was entering a place where I would always have to hide who I was. Alexander looked at him. And now? Ethan smiled softly. Now I think I found a place where I can finally be honest. Alexander understood the importance of those words. Ethan had not simply found a new home. He had found someone who accepted every part of his story. But as their bond grew stronger, the people who knew the truth about Ethan's past began making their own decisions. They knew the hidden Omega beside the throne was no ordinary person. They knew his abilities had been kept secret for a reason. Soon, the kingdom would face a moment when Ethan could no longer remain in the background. The image of the powerless Omega was beginning to disappear, and the truth waiting beneath it was closer than ever to being revealed. The royal palace had changed since Ethan Rivers first arrived. The same halls that once carried quiet judgment now carried conversations filled with curiosity and respect. The nobles who had once dismissed him as a powerless Omega no longer knew what to believe. They had watched him advise the prince, solve difficult situations, and remain calm when others lost control. Yet despite the changes around him, Ethan knew that the hardest moment was still approaching. His past was no longer something that could remain hidden forever. One morning, Alexander Whitmore received an urgent report from the royal advisors. Information about Ethan's family history had reached several powerful groups outside the kingdom. The forgotten name of the Rivers family was appearing again, and with it came questions that could not be ignored. Alexander immediately asked Ethan to join him in the royal strategy room. In the past, he might have made decisions alone. Now, he waited for Ethan's thoughts first. They are trying to understand who you are, Alexander said. Ethan looked over the documents placed before him. No, they are trying to decide who they want me to be. Alexander understood the difference. People were not searching for the truth. They were searching for a version of Ethan that matched their expectations. During the meeting, several royal advisors expressed concern about Ethan's hidden history. They questioned whether someone with such a mysterious background should remain close to the throne. Their words were polite, but their doubts were clear. Ethan listened without interruption. When it was his turn to speak, he did not defend himself with emotion. Instead, he explained the situation with patience and logic. He showed how the missing records connected to his family were not signs of weakness, but evidence of a legacy that had been misunderstood. Alexander watched the room carefully. He saw the same thing he had noticed from the beginning. Ethan did not need to demand respect. He earned it naturally. After the meeting, Alexander and Ethan walked through the palace corridors together. You could have revealed your identity much earlier, Alexander said. Ethan looked ahead. And would people have believed me? Alexander thought about the answer. He knew they probably would not have. Many people needed proof before they changed their opinions. I am sorry they made you feel like you had to hide, Alexander said. Ethan smiled gently. You did not. Those simple words meant everything to Alexander. He realized Ethan was not blaming the world. He was simply accepting what happened and choosing what came next. However, outside the palace, those who remembered Ethan's true history began preparing for the moment when the kingdom would finally learn the truth. They had once believed Ethan's silence meant he had nothing to offer. They had mistaken patience for weakness and kindness for helplessness. They did not understand that Ethan had spent years learning, preparing, and waiting for the right moment. That evening, Alexander stood with Ethan on the palace balcony overlooking the kingdom. When the truth becomes known, everything will change, Alexander said. Ethan looked at the city below. Maybe, but hiding forever would change even more. Alexander nodded. For the first time, he understood that Ethan was not trying to reclaim a forgotten identity. He was choosing to reveal the person he had always been. And soon, the entire kingdom would witness the moment when the Omega they underestimated finally showed the truth they never expected. The moment Ethan Rivers had spent years avoiding finally arrived when the truth about his past began reaching every corner of the kingdom. For many people, the revelation was difficult to accept. The Omega they had ignored, the one they believed was only a weakness beside the throne, was connected to a legacy far greater than they imagined. But Ethan did not feel the need to prove himself anymore. He had spent enough time allowing others to define him. Now, he was ready to let the truth speak for itself. The royal palace prepared for an important gathering where representatives from noble families across the kingdom would meet with Alexander Whitmore. Everyone knew the purpose of the meeting. They wanted answers about Ethan Rivers. The same people who once laughed at the prince's decision now watched carefully, searching for any sign that their original opinions had been correct. Ethan entered the grand hall beside Alexander. This time, he did not walk behind him. He stood beside him. That small action showed everyone that their relationship had changed. Alexander did not see Ethan as someone who needed protection. He saw him as an equal partner. During the gathering, several nobles questioned Ethan about his family history. Their questions were carefully chosen, designed to challenge his place near the throne. But Ethan remained calm. He explained the history of the Rivers family and the responsibility they had carried for generations. He spoke about knowledge, preparation, and protecting the kingdom through understanding rather than recognition. The room became quiet as people listened. They expected arrogance. They expected excuses. Instead, they found someone who carried himself with humility and confidence. Alexander watched the reactions around him and realized something important. Ethan had never needed to become powerful. He had always been powerful. The only difference was that now people were finally willing to see it. Later that day, Alexander and Ethan walked through the palace gardens. The pressure of the gathering was behind them, but both knew the situation was not finished. You handled everything calmly, Alexander said. Ethan looked at the flowers along the pathway. Because I stopped trying to convince people who had already decided not to understand me. Alexander smiled. That sounds like something you learned a long time ago. Ethan nodded. It was. Their conversation was interrupted by news from the royal advisors. Information had arrived about a group of people attempting to create uncertainty around the throne. They believed Ethan's history could be used to weaken Alexander's position. But they misunderstood something important. Ethan's past was not a weakness. It was the reason he was prepared for difficult moments. As the kingdom entered a period of uncertainty, Alexander refused to hide Ethan or distance himself from him. Instead, he made his position clear. Ethan was not a problem to solve. He was the person he trusted most. That evening, Ethan stood in the royal library looking at the old records of his family. For years, those pages represented a past he could never return to. Now, they represented a future he could finally accept. Alexander joined him and placed a hand on the table beside the documents. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Ethan looked at him and smiled. Those words carried more meaning than any royal announcement. For the first time, Ethan was not carrying his history alone. Beyond the palace walls, the people who had underestimated him were beginning to understand the truth. The Omega they called useless was never powerless. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal who he truly was. The kingdom had changed, but the greatest change was not found in the royal halls or the opinions of the nobles. It was found in the way people finally saw Ethan Rivers. For years, his name had been connected with misunderstanding. He was the Omega people overlooked, the person they believed could never stand beside a future king. But now, after the truth of his past became known, the kingdom began to understand that they had never truly known him at all. The royal palace prepared for a new chapter. Alexander Whitmore stood before the court with Ethan beside him, not behind him, showing everyone that their bond was built on trust and equality. The same nobles who once questioned the prince's decision now watched in silence. They remembered their doubts. They remembered the way they dismissed Ethan without knowing his story. But Ethan did not look at them with anger. He had already moved beyond needing their approval. Alexander addressed the court with confidence. A person's value is not decided by rumors, titles, or assumptions. It is revealed through their choices, their character, and the way they treat others. The words reflected everything he had learned since meeting Ethan. He had once believed protecting someone meant standing in front of them. Now he understood that true partnership meant standing beside them. Ethan looked across the room and saw the people who once misunderstood him. He knew some opinions would take time to change, but he also knew the truth no longer needed to remain hidden. His family's legacy was not about fame or power. It was about responsibility, patience, and protecting what mattered. After the gathering, Ethan and Alexander walked through the palace gardens. The morning sunlight covered the paths, creating a peaceful atmosphere after so much uncertainty. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we never met?" Alexander asked. Ethan considered the question. "I think we both would have continued carrying things alone." Alexander smiled. "And now?" Ethan looked at the palace, the kingdom beyond it, and the future ahead. "Now we know we do not have to." Their journey had started with doubt. A prince chose an Omega that everyone believed was the wrong decision. A quiet person entered a world that expected him to fail. But over time, both discovered something they never expected. Strength was not always shown through authority. Sometimes it appeared through patience, kindness, and the courage to remain true to yourself. The people of the kingdom eventually stopped seeing Ethan as the Omega who needed a place beside the throne. They began seeing him as someone who helped make the throne stronger. Alexander was no longer the prince who carried every responsibility alone. He was a leader with someone beside him who understood the weight of his choices. Together, they created a new image of what power could be. Not something built on fear or appearances, but something built on trust and respect. Years later, stories about the royal couple would no longer focus on the doubts that surrounded their beginning. They would tell the story of how a misunderstood Omega changed an entire kingdom's perspective. They would remember how the person everyone underestimated became the person everyone respected. And they would remember that sometimes the greatest strength is hidden in the person everyone chooses not to see.